Have you got big questions about God? Are you wrestling with doubts?
Welcome to Questioning Christianity.
We believe that truth invites questioning, and that faith is not a blind leap in the dark,
but a response to the light of God's revelation.
So whether it's God's hiddenness or history,
science or scripture,
ethics or evidence,
purpose or pain,
we create content to take questioners and their questions seriously.
We talk with scholars for expert insights and lay out the reasons why Christianity is worth believing.
Questioning Christianity.
Connecting the Christian story to life's deepest questions.
Well, do stories have the answer to our culture's search for meaning? That's what we're going to be diving into today with author Kiri Jane Erb. Kiri, welcome to the channel.
Thank you for having me.
For those who are brand new, this is Questioning Christianity. I'm Dan Patterson, and this channel is all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And apologetics is part of what we do, exploring philosophy and history and theology. But Kiri, apologetics has gone mainstream in the last 12 months. People have been talking about how it was disappearing. No one cares about these old questions anymore. And then your colleague at Apologetics Canada, Wes Huff, a little-known Canadian nerd, all of a sudden shoots on to the stage with an episode of the Joe Rogan podcast, and basically has done the rounds now, handing out Christian artifacts to podcasters right around North America. But it's just brought these questions right back to the fore. It's wild. So I'm glad to have you on today as someone who has just published her book here, Love, War, and the Mess in Between. It's going to be available in all good bookstores this Friday particularly, but want to dig into the themes of this book. But maybe just start with that. Why address these big existential apologetics questions of evil and meaning and hope and fear and anxiety and trauma? And what is it that made you want to get in and dig into that?
Yeah, I think you nailed that in terms of, I wanted to go deep. I think there's a real hunger that we see even in our church congregation and with those that we share life with, that they're, it's nice that there's small books and good accessible answers and that sort of thing, but so many people are hungering and thirsting for more. And through discipleship, walking with different people, realizing that I wanted to take people on a journey. And by taking people on a journey, I was able to unravel some of the contents of these questions and consider them, put them on the table.
Well, you cover actually a lot of ground. So the book's 476 pages, at least the paperback version that I have. People can get the audiobook versions or the digital versions with Kindle and others. Then it may be a different format, but it's got some serious length to it. And I want to talk a little bit just today, not about just the contents of the book, but the medium as well, because you're kind of swimming in that tradition of using fiction as a means of addressing these apologetics questions. And there's good precedence with that. But maybe just begin with some of the themes, because you cover a lot of questions and experiences, things like, why does evil exist? And how do we make sense of where evil fits into our worldview? Is morality grounded in something real, or does it have some deep ontological foundation, or is it just a product of socio-cultural evolution? Does suffering disprove God and that age-old problem of evil as it relates to the Christian faith? Is Christianity intellectually credible, and are there reasons to believe it? What gives meaning to a life? You talk about abuse and trauma, which are pretty heavy parts of the book. There's a philosophy of existentialism that gets a mention. You look at mythology. You look for the search of love and belonging. Like, there's so many deep themes, even the place for friendship, that are tied into this. Are you biting off more than you can chew in a single book? Or did you do that because, and it's just more true to life, is that we're never just pulling out one thread and dealing with it in isolation, but we're always this ball of experiences and questions? I'm curious what drove you to take on so much.
Right. And I think that's a really fair question. It's something that I was wrestling with as I was writing this. Originally, I was going to pare it back a lot more to make it just an easier read. And then realizing, you know what, like, life isn't easy. And we are going to have, as you say, all these experiences thrown to us. And often the questions that we think we're asking are not the real questions that are going on in our heart either. So what's nestling those big questions within like narrative threads, really 3 narrative threads, allow me to do was approach these almost one at a time, but with some clear themes, in order to give them their moment. Because so many of them are connected, right? So problem of evil, question of like hiddenness, God, where are you? What does it really look like to have, an encounter with God? And those things are really hard to write and to think about from a step back. But while on the one side, it's a lot of things to be wrestling with. On the other side, I wanted to take those things seriously and not patronize a reader and say, oh, we can't go there. Being like, let's sit down together. Let's take this seriously.
I really appreciated the fact that it does just feel human, and it does have that storied approach where we don't act as logical calculators dealing with these in isolation. You're kind of fumbling your way through life and bumping into these realities and trying to make sense of them. And it just felt like the book was a means of doing that through a storied approach. And in there, you spoke about there being these 3 different perspectives. There's kind of 2 main characters, Peter and Alexei, and we won't give away too much in it, but I want to ask you about them. And then there's these cutbacks to kind of World War II scenes. And I just found that fascinating to try and help just think through these big ideas of evil and injustice and ideology and how much they're instantiated in the world. And it brings up this other reality that you have to wrestle with too. But can we talk about Peter and Alexei?
Yeah, sure.
Because you've kind of given these 2 personality profiles, these fictional characters that you've developed. Peter plays more of the, I guess, what we'd consider an internet skeptic kind of role.
Right.
Very thoughtful. He's got the objections and the barriers to Christian belief. Alexei, she plays a very different role, with experiences of pain and trauma and maybe that wariness then that comes along with that. Maybe speak to where did these 2 characters come from for you, and what drove you to give them that sort of a profile? Do you think that, again, is trying to match where people are as they're wrestling with these questions, or is that something from your own story?
Right. Yeah, I think there's multi-layers to that. So to give some context, as you said, there's the World War II thread. The thread with that Peter is the protagonist on is kind of the 1990s. And the reason that I wanted to place him there is that it makes sense with some of the other story elements. And if you read the book, that'll come together there. But also it allowed him to have quite like, as you said, like maybe an internet skeptic, but also a measured personality. He's meant to be a maths teacher, kind of lived quite a chill life. Right. And he suddenly hit rock bottom. And now it's like, hey, what am I going to do? Well, I guess I'll visit my school friend. And he's a Christian now. Like, what's going on with that? And then he ends up going into Paris because, when you've hit rock bottom, why not? Let's see what's out there. Right. And gets caught up in this really interesting leftist kind of experiment, really, that happens in the Vosges Mountains. And so tracing his story was really fun and allowed me to weave in not just those story elements, but some of the influences of my childhood. So growing up in the 90s, because I'm an 80s baby, growing up in the 90s, it was full of Dawkins and the neo-atheists. And as you say, like, culture's almost coming around now to realize that the stories that were told about human nature being dancing DNA, that kind of thing, doesn't really hold water for the breadth of our human experience. But I think being in that sort of time frame in the 90s, some of those questions are what my character Peter's absorbed, or some of those thoughts. And yeah, I think seeing him realize that firsthand, can there be more than this like materialist, scientific, reductionist kind of world? Is there more to me? What does this mean? Asking all those big questions, it was a privilege to think that through whilst, putting on that character hat. The other character there is Alexei. So she's in the early 2000s. You only a couple of chapters in, you realize that. So I'm not giving too much away. That Alexei is Peter's daughter, and yet she didn't grow up with him in her life. And she was actually told a story that he was bad, abusive. She's only ever heard negative things about him. the interesting thing is that one day somebody shows up at her door with a half filled in like child support form, but it has a address on it. And that address gives her the first insight into, a trail of her father who she's never met. And so she's trying to piece together who he is. And this, as you said, afforded me the ability to pull on these like big questions of where love doesn't just mean, and like there's some moments in the book where there's the romantic love, but also love to do with a father-daughter relationship and what it means to navigate the world and try to seek love in these different places, which obviously then is impacted by our closeness or alienation, like with God. And so it's from that launch pad that I was then able to bring in, existentialism, all these questions, philosophy. Yeah.
And I think just that humanizing of people's wrestle with these big questions over time, as soon as we abstract them, you kind of lose the fact that we're a ball of motivations within and a ball of experiences, and they influence the way we hear God language. They influence the way we listen to evidence. They influence our interaction with the case for Christianity, or whether the good news sounds like good news or whether it sounds controlling. And so I just really kind of appreciate that as a medium. And like we said, that's got a long heritage of doing Christian worldview advocacy or talking about the Christian faith, trying to present the gospel through the medium of fictional stories. You've got Dostoevsky's famous Brothers Karamazov. You've got C.S. Lewis and Tolkien as friends in Oxford, and the Inklings trying to do this throughout the 20th century. And I mean, with huge influence on Christian imagination today. What is it about that medium, about fiction particularly, where it's not trying to evaluate the historical claims, but it's just using that storied approach that allows you to do what Lewis said, to steal past the watchful dragons of our conscious reasoning? What is it about the medium that you think is just so helpful in presenting the Christian faith?
Right. I think it affords you the opportunity to trace contours of the human life, right? That you're going to have those mountaintop experiences, but you're also going to have those massive lows. And making sense of that and the ruptures that often come into life in terms of trauma, the interruption of death within life. I think, that is the common human experience. And so to be able to trace a path, or multiple paths in this case, like through that, and be honest about it, is just something that you can't really get in the same way if you're just doing bullet points. So I'm trying to incorporate truth and weave that in alongside the element of heart wrestle, right? And these questions popping up kind of everywhere. And in doing so, I was trying to also bring in other voices. So I mentioned existentialism before, so bring in like people like Jean-Paul Sartre, but also like his friend and later kind of frenemy, Albert Camus. And like Camus, for example, he addresses questions of like evil and suffering, and in that, for example, the plague, which became quite popular during our plague back with COVID, it allows the opportunity to realize that there's lots of influences for us as humans, right? Our relational influences, the influences of our culture and our cultural moment, those influences, things we've read, things we've seen. And so, yeah, I think that by weaving threads through being able to have rhythm, by having symbolism, it gives you the medium to engage with that.
Yeah, and it gives you space to for not tying off everything neatly. In that my human experience is rarely are the questions that we have, particularly the way we interact with the resources of the Bible. You don't get exhaustive answers, but you get bits where maybe the story you've been told growing up, and like for the 90s, a lot of this either hard materialism or hard existentialism, like if postmodernism was all the rage. You hear answers that feel in vogue or that even feel intellectually right, but you said just don't match the contours of the human heart. And you have to decide, all right, do I annex this part of my humanity? Do I annex my soulishness? Do I annex my thought that love really is some supreme ethic deeply rooted in the fabric of reality? Or is it just a biochemical reaction designed to aid survival? You're like, which interpretation of reality do I accept actually sheds light on these deeper features of our human experience. And it kind of feels now, if I'm curious about your experience there in Canada, like that's part of where some Aussies who are thoughtful are arriving. They're like, look, I bought the New Atheist story for a while and it felt interesting and right and intellectually superior. But you know what? Actually, the Christian faith had more to it intellectually than what I gave it credit for. And it was caricatured pretty badly. But more than that, the kind of secular New Atheist story just left me unresolved and left me with anxieties and left me with a story that couldn't quite carry enough meaning in life or strength through suffering or a whole range of just existential walls that we're bumping into. That's left people open again to spirituality. Is that maybe a similar phenomenon as what you're experiencing in Canada?
100%. I think for me personally and some of those around in this area of the world, I think just even seeing what's happening with Ian Hesieli a couple of years ago, right? Going from, singing from the same hymn book, ironically, as Dawkins, to then sitting in the distant dialogues, right? Just telling about her heart, like her human experience, how she like hit kind of rock bottom, and how Jesus really, was the one that pulled her from that. And I think that sort of like human engagement, realizing that, she could have the most impressive doctors, right? And yet it was somebody saying, well, have you actually like considered spirituality, right? Have you considered kind of God as a resource, right? Or like his grace. I think it took some of those conversations, right, to see that shift in her life. And I think we're starting to put that back on the table culturally. So here on the west coast of Canada, it's very interesting because it's so different than the east or in the middle. So interestingly enough, I've lived in all three places over the last kind of 15, 20 years. Actually, like bit more backstory. I'm a Brit in Canada who has like a Kiwi name, right? Like I'm named after the Kiri Jane Erb, the opera singer. But I've lived in three different.
You're a colonial nightmare, basically.
Right. That's great. So yeah, but anyways, I've also lived in various places, but including Montreal, which Quebec is very secular. It still is, like less than 1% kind of Christians. But that was really where I actually found Jesus for the first time, or rather, the classic "He Found Me." And so that was very different than my experience of living for 10 years in Saskatchewan, which is kind of the Bible Belt of Canada. It's right in the middle. It's a rural situation there. It's a beautiful place, beautiful people. Definitely felt like a hidden season, but where God was fomenting things inside of me, which I'm forever thankful for. But that's, again, very different than here on the West Coast. So because of the Pacific Northwest kind of tribes originally, there's quite a push towards the appreciation of spiritual things, but it's not necessarily Christian spiritual things. And so you have a really interesting range of things happening in Canada. On the West Coast here, I think spirituality is on the table. It's just talking about the distinctives of Jesus.
And it's that kind of question of which story makes the best sense of reality then that's kind of at work. And maybe for people that are listening to this and thinking, I do have my doubts, I'm quite philosophically inclined, there is just this constant reality that we bump into where you kind of are always faced with tensions, unanswered questions purely from cold materialistic explanations. That it's like, could these other stories provide resources and answers to help? And I think particularly through suffering, through hardship, through the questions of evil, which I want to get in. But one of the themes you pick up in the book, which I found quite interesting, was the theme of beauty.
Right.
And you kind of get there through Wagner's operas, you get there through appreciation of classical artworks, you get there through even architecture, and like the different architecture that civilizations produce. And you sort of think, man, what is motivating the kind of artisans when they go in to do their work. And I want to think just about beauty for a second, because it's something we don't talk about a ton. It motivates a lot of advertising, right? And the way that things get sold. But this appreciation or hunger for beauty, why do you think that matters philosophically? And where do you think that kind of fits into the kind of case for Christianity that you want to put forward?
Yeah. I think that in our world, there's a lot of shouting, right? There's a lot of things coming out of us from different directions. Like, you need to do this, you need to be this. I think the thing with beauty is that it whispers, right? It whispers like to our hearts, and it pulls us up. And so one of the ways that I engage with this within the book is kind of riffing off the like Francis Schaeffer, Nancy Pearcey, like two-story kind of layer of the world, which really is a kind of retracing of a somewhat like Platonist kind of way of thinking about the world around us. That there is this kind of this upper story, this more transcendental kind of realm. And within that, like if we look at the history of the church, generally the transcendentals are the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I think there are cases, as you say, to be made for where do we find the good, the true, and the beautiful? Where do we anchor our morality? Why do we care about things? Where are our values from? Can we stand upon those things? And in the case of beauty, I think it's definitely having its moment. There's a lot of conversation around beauty because I think we're now seeing the consequences of different things, right? We're seeing the acerbic kind of consequence of that reductionist, materialist kind of worldview, of brutalist architecture, of that kind of even minimalism, right? Can have the ability to do that. And I think there's a reappreciation of what is valuable, right, in our lives. How do we hold that? How do we nurture that? How do we release that? Taking moments to perceive the beauty in the world around us. Like, I love how the Bible talks about how God creates with his fingertips. It's not as if, that's an analogy, but it's not as if he just squeezed out the world and somehow it just got here. It's like there's this graceful, exuding, kind of overflowing, and
God delighting in the work of his hands.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's it. And he's like inviting us into more, right? To encounter him. And I think
it's those sort of experiences that people bump into, Kiri, like you see a incredible night sky when you go out camping, which I guess people do in Canada too, or for us, the sunrise over the ocean,
right?
And just the colors, and it's wild. Like, it's just so beautiful, and it's moments like that where you're just like awed. And where do I direct that? What am I awed at? What is this sense of just wonder that's overtaking me? And is that some inbuilt GPS that's meant to be taking me home, to be recognizing that we do inhabit a cosmic cathedral, that is meant to inspire worship towards God? So I found those moments of beauty, to borrow Peter Berger or Os Guinness, those sort of signals of transcendence, where we kind of get caught up in life and, it's another day and I need coffee and I need to get through the rhythms. And then you just bump into beauty, and it might be a song or a lyric, or it might be artwork, or it might be nature. And it just kind of stops you in your tracks, and you're like, where do I categorize that? How does that fit into how I see the world? And it's like the rays of heaven piercing the dreary clouds of a materialistic existence,
Exactly.
It awakens you to something more. And I mean, I don't think they're knockdown arguments in any way, but I do think it's sort of this, these are part of the deep human experience. Does my story make room for that in a way that doesn't squash that? And it's not a reductionistic story that ends up flattening out that reality, but it animates it and gives it life.
That's right.
What do you like? Does that resonate with you, or am I just weird and talking nonsense?
No, that's exactly where I was trying to go with the book, right? Is, as you say, it's realizing that the story that I was sold as a kid was very flattening of who we are as people, right? And didn't have that deep appreciation for the height, breadth, depth of who we are, our embodied existence, any of that, right? You might as well be like brains and vats, right? Especially how the school system worked. And yet I think with an embodied Christ, Jesus, the Logos, like taking on flesh, you have a God who cares about the human, cares about humanity, wants to reestablish our humanity within us, and our communities where we've kind of lost and abandoned that, right? And redirect us. And he doesn't do that again by like shouting or compulsion. He does that through like deep, like one-on-one, like connection, right? And then connecting us to each other through his body. I think there's a real beauty to just even the vision of that, and the grace within like the grace with which he does that. It's a receiving, and then that pulls us into engagement with him, as opposed to a world where we're just kind of taking all the time. It's a very different way to live. But I think beauty evokes that and helps us lock into that rhythm and way of being.
And that's, I guess, part of the strength of a story, in that stories help us make sense of who we are, but then they also give us a script for life. If you're saying, a story provides answers to life's deepest questions, or at least the resources to wrestle towards answers, which is what I would say in the Christian story. It doesn't spoon feed you an easy answer to the problem of evil, but it gives you rich resources to make sense of what might be some of God's reasons, of the limits of humans in knowing God's reasons, but then whether or not we can trust in the character of God in the midst of our own dark nights of the soul, or where heaven goes dark. It just gives you kind of the resource to make sense of it, but then it also then gives you a script and says, all right, let me show you how you can live in light of this, and how the wisdom to be able to navigate life. And like you said before, even the crutch to lean on. Is Christianity a crutch? I'm like, it's a big one, absolutely. That doesn't mean it's not true, and you don't just believe it because you want it to be true. But yes, it's a story that will help you bear up through significant hardship. But with one hand, Jesus may offer you this crutch, and it's comforting and it provides rest and hope. But with the other hand, he also hands you a cross and bids you to come and die to yourself. So it's not like it's a story just to bring you comfort. It actually will bring you a profound challenge. Yeah,
it's not easy.
And I think that's part of why I appreciated your book, in the telling of these stories and the pain and the brokenness relationally, and then the jump backs to these World War II scenes, which I want to chat about next, is it just is so not easily reconciled, deep, rich. There's brokenness, but there's also ways in which just the bigger answers that you're spelling out through there from the Bible, the Christian story, really do speak and offer healing and hope and a way forward. And it just felt true to life. And maybe we'll talk at the end too about how you do storytelling and apologetics talks and evangelism in light of those sort of very human dynamics, rather than just abstract arguments. But could we maybe face the moral realism question? Because the World War II scenes are confronting, and like the longer we get, when I was born in the 80s too, I come up on 40 this year, which is just a big milestone. But the World War II still felt recent. So when we grew up and learning about World War II history, it felt recent. It felt like you were still living in the shadow of its effects, because my parents were children of the wartime generation. And so the scars of the war were visited on my mum and dad, who their character and experience of childhood was shaped by the austerity of wartime parents and by the emotional trauma of wartime parents. But for us today, it kind of feels alien. 40 years on, we're nearly 100 years from World War II. We're coming up on that in a decade and a bit. And so it's just a long way. And the jump back into those scenes, though, it just gives you the fruits of rigid ideology. It makes you deal with the stories of real atrocities, and we see them lived out in the world today. What were you hoping to achieve by taking people back to these darker scenes from World War II? What was the intent in this third major thread in the story?
Yeah, definitely multiple intents. As you say, like I didn't just want to talk about evil and suffering as an abstract concept. So it definitely afforded that opportunity. I think the other thing is that a lot of the theology and philosophy that I wanted to engage with, so for example, existentialism is some of the fruit of people living out those experiences, right? So popularizing that would, in like the late 1940s, early 1950s, you've got like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, right? And so, it became quite fashionable to be an existentialist, and we throw around like existential crisis and stuff even today, right? We still see like little bits of those kind of around in our cultural language, which is interesting. But I wanted to tie the lived experience to the trauma of that, and then the thinking about that. And so to have the thinking about that through the mouths, through the writing of people who had experienced that sort of deep trauma was a real gift in a ways, and I wanted to portray those people well, right? In certain levels, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, they've lived very different lives, had very different values than maybe myself or some of my community. But at the same time, there's some really good insights to things. I think, at a similar time, there was a playwright called Gabriel Marcel, and I think when he was about our age, I think we're about the same age. I'm 39 as well. I think it's either 38 or 39. He became a Christian because a friend, Francois Mauriac, basically was like, "Why aren't you joining our side, really? Because all the stuff you're talking about is like ethics and like Christian morality and stuff. Like, what's going on here?" But one of the things that Marcel, as a friend of Sartre, again, as said, was, like he's saying some very true things, in terms of the human heart. So like for somebody who was an atheist, he said, like from pretty much just found out he was an atheist about the age of 12, he's putting his finger on something to do with the human experience and the human life, and especially after the war, like he's giving extra voice to that. Because if you've been through trauma, really hard choices, that kind of thing, then existentialism kind of makes some sense. It gives voice, especially in France, to a whole nation that had gone through trauma, a whole nation that had gone through this identity crisis, right? Are we to like capitulate? Are we to join with like Vichy France, or do we like join with like Charles de Gaulle and like fight off, right, the Nazis and the National Socialists, kind of who have basically taken control of our nation? There's this whole identity crisis. Who are we? Like, what about shame? What about guilt? And so what existentialism did in a way was, I think, speak to that. It didn't necessarily give a get out of jail free card, but what it did was say there weren't any good choices, that there's no objective kind of morality, that, religion, even other ethical frameworks to do with duty, they can't give you right answers, according to Sartre. And so you can see why that would be really appealing kind of at that time. Now, what Marcel kind of then pointed out was, okay, like, Sartre and those like him, I could say the same for somebody like going further back, like Nietzsche, for example, right? They can be great diagnosticians of what's happening, like the emptiness of the human heart, right? The pursuit of things to try to ground our being, in the case of Sartre. But that they're not giving, in some cases deliberately, right, any way to, any orientation, any way to resurrect, any way to get out of a almost like
there's no redemption story.
There's no redemption story at all. And I think Gabriel Marcel does a great job of adding a counterpoint to somebody like Sartre. Weaving that explicitly, say, hang on, right? This makes total sense what you're saying if you then consider like the story of the fall, if you consider like Jesus, and then you can get redemption, then you can get the resurrection, like peace. And as you mentioned before, the story of Jesus gives us something that nothing else does, right? Not only is it true historically, right, that you have all the evidence that goes along with that, right, that as apologists we can pull on, but we can talk about somebody else around the same sort of time, like Paul Ricoeur, who talked about the power of narrative, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and then it can form almost like a backbone for our own stories. And it is that resurrection, that the redemptive, the interruption of life in the midst of death, that makes all the difference, right? Because otherwise in life, we're just rearranging the pieces and struggling and trying to keep ourselves alive. Trauma in a sense is death interrupting life, right? Jesus is life interrupting death, right? I love the way that Jesus, he takes on flesh. He engages with all these things like head on, like at the cross, like literally engages with death. And yet death could not hold him, right? That you have this clear engagement, this acknowledgement that of the hold of death that we've been under, a hold of sin, the the chaos really that our culture and our world has been smothered in, and Jesus brings that freshness, that the reality, the life that we should be living in, that we can live in. I think that is incredibly unique.
Mm. Yeah, and there's just the moral currency too, I think, of words like good and
Mm.
evil and
Yep.
how we can make sense of them are big in this regard. And
100%.
because we've got this, pardon me, distance from World War II,
Yeah.
we are seeing some evil things play out globally, and certainly some atrocities in how human beings' lives are being torn apart, and governments stand behind it, and the justifications that are given, and this big cosmic war between ideologies and geopolitics and
Yeah.
economies, and we're trying to say, man, where do we stand? How do we respond? What do we protest against? Like, what are we advocating for?
Right.
What's the basis for us making any of these decisions? And then one thing that I do find just troubling is, outside of some kind of moral anchor in the
Yes.
world, this sort of moral emotivism or
Mhm.
sociocultural evolution of morality, or
Right.
just the various ways metaethical questions are answered outside of the God stuff, just seems to me to be really coming up short with the moral resources to deal with our outrage right now. So you think of like the release of the Epstein files, for instance,
Right.
and just some of the practices that have been in there, which just defy. I mean, you hear conspiracy theories about the evil that is happening amongst elites globally, and you're like,
Mhm.
yeah, I just think that's all made up stories. And then you read some of what was going on in rituals that were
Yeah.
being done, and you're from firsthand testimony, and it genuinely just shakes you to the core. It's like there's a
Yeah.
kind of evil at work here that you don't know how to categorize. And I'm curious. I even saw on today on Twitter, the font of
Mhm.
all knowledge, but a message by Elon Musk, incredibly controversial figure, has all kinds of interesting takes on the world. But he's quote tweeting here a comment that said, "Evil is a load bearing concept, and our dismissal of it is destroying civilization. Figure out how to work it into your worldview quickly." And that kind of worldview
Mhm.
analysis, do
Yeah.
you have a place for evil?
Right.
Like, does darkness fit within your moral resources to say that is seriously evil and we need to stamp it out? We need to call for justice. We need to be able to oppose that. Does
Right.
your worldview have the ground upon which you can
Mhm.
stand, or have you sat upon the branch and philosophically sawn it off
Right.
with
Yeah.
what it
Yeah.
is you believe? What's your sense around people wrestling with this concept of darkness, of evil, of this role of World War II in your book? Do you feel like there are the moral resources within a secular society to make sense of that anymore, or have we become cut off from the kind of roots of the Christian story in a way that has left us free floating?
I think that's a really good analogy, right? I think it's the C.S. Lewis, like soaring off the branch that you're sitting on.
Mm,
I think, yeah, it is a tricky situation that we're in societally because, you know, do you actually have the grounds for moral kind of outrage if morality is just mere preference?
mm,
Right? Because then you can change that, right? Then it evolves. Like, is it meant to be calibrated according to your culture or your tribe, your group, your
mm.
ideology? Um,
And if we're honest about how the outrage happens, it's so selective. You
right.
pick a cause to ignore everyone else, but it just seems like one that has politically motivated underpinnings. And yeah, it's just the moral outrage doesn't seem to be a genuine stand for justice against all darkness and evil of that kind.
Right. And then, you work in human nature and you have like virtue signaling as like part of that, right? And just the wanting to be a part of a tribe. Um, I think, yeah, I think it is important to resource or re-resource our imagination and our the way that we understand the
Mhm.
world with an understanding of clear good and clear evil. And I think being able to anchor that right outside of human preference
Definitely.
is critical if we're going to be able to have any consistency to what
Mm,
we care about, right? And to be able to actually justify those things in a sustainable
mm,
way. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because a couple of years, well, not so much now, but maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, like critical theory, for example, would be the big thing that people were talking about, right? Is a lot of the injustice because of certain groups. It's looking for blame. right? For
Between
good
the
or
oppressor
evil.
and oppressed, or degrees of
Exactly.
intersectionality. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think while it's good to, properly assess the situation and see what's going on and what we can change, that sort of thing, I think often the result of that hasn't been redemptive. Often it can lead to more violence, right? So we get into a situation where our world seems to be stuck in these cycles of violence. And I'm struck often, if you just go back to like the Sermon on the Mount, or even just the way that Jesus doesn't open his mouth on the cross, right? The way that he's able to do this life-changing, world-changing thing, right? By pouring out his life and engaging with sin and death head on, and yet doing so without more violence is actually undercutting that. He's the one, right, that's being essentially like abused, tortured, right? And yet he's offering forgiveness in that place. He's interposing love, right, in a way that the world, I think, just doesn't understand. And yet once we interface with that, we're like, okay, like that's the power of that is actually earth-shattering. I think that's why it had the cultural currency to be able to undercut, the Roman Empire, somewhat acerbic, right, to the Roman emperors and their rule. That's why it becomes a threat, even though it's an ethic of love.
Yeah, and there's something about the Christian story about the idea of the bookends of the Bible. Genesis 1 and 2, God's creation as he intended it. Genesis 21 and 22, the new creation as he intended it.
Yeah.
But then there's the meat between, from Genesis 3 to Revelation 20, where you're living in a fallen world, where this is not God's will done on earth as it will be in heaven. And how much that just makes sense of this deep intuition we have that this is not the way that things should be.
Yes.
C.S. Lewis in his Mere Christianity sort of reflects on his atheism and just thought, I used to have this big complaint, the problem of evil, that the good God with the power that he has should be able to create a world where there is no evil and suffering. So this world cannot be the product of an all-loving, all-powerful creator. But then he's like, but why? If I'm just part of a natural system that is baptized by suffering from beginning to end, why do I find myself in revolt against it? And like this deep intuition that people have today, that this is not how things should be.
That's it,
like that should, or that ought, or that sense of the tracks that this world's train should be on. I just think that's an intuition that fits well within the Christian story, that you have a good creation that's gone awry, that needs to be remade, rather than the kind of secular story, which just says, yep, ultimate meaningless. There's no rhyme or reason. Evil is just again, socio-evolutionary psychological development. It just doesn't seem to have the same explanatory resources to stand on. And that's why I've found that compelling. And Os Guinness, who's been a mentor figure for me, he said in his book on the problem of evil and darkness and doubt, he's like, look, yep, the problem of evil as framed by Epicurus and Hume and any of the major atheist philosophers today, I can understand how that makes you want to get rid of God, but get rid of God and you bump into an entirely new problem of evil, which is the inability to account for the evilness of evil and the inability to say that suffering is wrong. That these are just part of the natural way of things, and there's no oughtness outside of that. I'm like, I find the Christian story makes sense of our deepest intuitions in that way. It doesn't cause us to have to, again, annex or flatten or numb our conscience to them. It allows them to come fully alive. And that's what I just love about the contours of your book. It's just giving space and human story to entertain these themes and allow that to be quickened in people's experience and to give some conscious reflection to it. One of the links that you make that I found very interesting, and I'd love you to speak to this, is the link between trauma and sacraments. Parse out that connection for us.
I think it's an insight that, in a sense, for me personally, became more intuitive after I'd been through like experiences of both grief and trauma in my own story, but also that theologians and friends have also been mining kind of some of the depth of this connection. So an example would be like Shelley Rambo, also Preston Hill out of Richmond College. I think the interesting thing with Holy Communion, with the Eucharist, is that often when, there's different ways to do it, but often when there's especially like a liturgical kind of unraveling of what's going on, there's an approach to the table. There's an approach to encountering and participating in the death and resurrection of Jesus that I think is beautifully coached. So recently, I'll give you an example. We had a women's conference here on the island, and I had the privilege of journeying with this wonderful group of women from our church in and through communion, which for some people was a really new thing, and others, evoked the sense of their childhood and that sort of thing. And so it was a really fun challenge to just gently explain and offer this journey together, this humble journey where we just came as we are, right, to the table with our pain, with our doubts, right? Whereas it's not about, even in that moment, really ministering to each other, but just being there together to approach Jesus and surrendering. Leaving things at the cross and resurrecting with him. It was a really powerful thing, actually, like to do and to acknowledge a need of Jesus. And it set the tone, really, I think, for the rest of the weekend, saying this is the shape, the contour of the Christian life. In a sense, it's not we come to Jesus for just our salvation and we leave, right? We never look at the cross again. Communion, I think, has this beautiful invitation of coming back to the cross. There's this dynamic work that shapes us, I think, from the inside out. And so when it comes to deep ruptures in life, especially those interruptions of trauma, right, where often an experience of death or near death has occurred, interrupting life, our stories can be shattered or can be broken, especially in trauma. Our understanding of the world, what we thought to be safe, what we thought that we knew was true, is suddenly not so. And so what's interesting there is the invitation in communion to anchor back into this story, to be able to find this bedrock and rebuild from there, to almost anchor these fragments of life around the story of Christ, and to let him minister through his grace. I think that rhythm and that dynamic work of the cross, that communal piece as well, because often in trauma you can feel really disconnected, isolated, even affects your understanding of time, right? There's been studies about that. I think Thomas Fuchs, a German psychologist, like he talks about how, trauma interrupts our understanding, not just of relationships, but because of that, our relational understanding of time, we get abstract. So what the communion, I think, so beautifully, again, invites us into is this communal rhythm in time that's embodied, that's centering explicitly around Jesus, where we can get shape to our life back, where we can start reforming and building kind of from there. And honestly, I always find that Jesus meets my heart in some way through going through. There's always something I need to bring to him, right? Like there's always something, whether it's doubt, whether it's pride, whether it's just pain, with rejection, whatever it might be, he meets powerfully through his Holy Spirit in that place. And so I think it's important for everybody. But I think it has a very unique role to play when it comes to healing, or at least approaching healing in the case of trauma.
I think that's beautiful, and I, having gone through some tragedy in life on multiple levels, just deeply resonate with that. And I just think that the church rehearses together the rhythms of the gospel, and in so doing, the various ways in which the cross speaks to people, whether it's a confrontation of your sin and therefore a quickening of your guilt in order to lead you to repentance, whether it is an answer of God to your suffering and to divine silence, where the cross is God speaking, shouting of the depths of his love for us, or whether when we consider the trauma or abuse that you may have endured, and you consider what is God's answer to what has been done by the hands of others to me, and that was to allow abuse and trauma to come to him at the hands of others. And how I remember Tim Keller introduced me to Edward Shillitoe's poem, the Jesus of the Scars, but to our wounds, only God's wounds speak. And there at the cross, you've got Jesus suffering the most profound levels of abuse and rejection from his creation to the physical endurance of what he suffered, the sense of alienation, right, and the nakedness, the shame, right, the just profound levels of abuse and trauma that happened there. But in his resurrection body, to still carry the scars, but to have moved into new life at the same time. It's not an undoing of these things. It's there are very real tears that he will wipe away in Revelation, but there are very real tears, and there are very real scars, and that persisted into his resurrection body. And John sees a lamb as though it had been slain in the image of Revelation, or the disciples can put their hands in the holes in his hands and in his feet and in his side. And you just think, yeah, wow, the story has profound layers that can speak to our suffering. And it doesn't just need to happen once, it needs to happen again and again and again, because as humans, we fall back into these cycles, and that gift then of gathering together regularly to eat of this bread and to drink of this wine. Yeah, it's powerful. So yeah, I really, that intrigued me, that connection that you drew there. For someone who, and I just really appreciate you taking the time to kind of wander through and give us a taste of what's in there. There's someone maybe who gets to the end of your book and still like, yeah, I don't know what I think about Christianity. They may still have questions that linger or doubts that are there. They may still have hopes that feel somewhat unmet. What would be your parting message to someone who's still has doubts?
Yeah. And actually, I was very intentional not to just make everything just super happy at the end, right? I wanted to leave it with tension. So I don't want to give too much away, but, you know, I think the stark difference that happens there is more reflective of the now and not yet, the life in which kind of we find ourselves. For somebody who's like, okay, but I wanted resolution, right? Or maybe they're, just not convinced yet. I would say just wrestle with Jesus, like wrestle with God, right? You're always marked by that process. And the whole point of the book, in a sense, is to honor the fact that people wrestle, right? And that doesn't mean you can not meet Jesus in that. In fact, I think that's so often, where he steps into that, right? He steps into the wrestle. So yeah, God's more than God enough for that and for our questions. And if he wasn't, then he wouldn't be God, but he is.
Yeah. Well, Kiri, thanks so much for giving us some time today just to tie up some of the threads in your book and to dig in. I hope it gets a big take up in the next few days as people start doing pre-orders. There's links to Kiri's bio. She's an adjunct speaker with Apologetics Canada, but also the director of theology at Soul Edge. And so you can check out those links in the description box below. Make sure you drop her a line to say hello. But thanks so much for everyone for getting to the end of this episode. It means a lot that you watch and appreciate the content that's here. If you have questions of your own, check out the rest of the videos on the channel. There's hundreds now helping you wrestle with most of the big questions you've got, or you can head over to questioningchristianity.com. Kiri, thanks for joining. And until next time, we'll say truth invites questioning. See you later.